The sun was a merciless hammer over New Mexico, beating the rust-colored earth into a shimmering haze. It was the summer of 1874, a season so dry the air itself felt brittle, ready to crack. Inside the belly of the iron beast chugging its way west, the heat was a physical presence, a thick, suffocating blanket woven from dust, sweat, and the close breath of strangers. The carriage swayed on the tracks, a rhythmic, groaning complaint against its own forward motion. The click-clack of the wheels a monotonous heartbeat for the desolate land it crossed. At the very end of the last car sat Ezra Holt. He was a man who seemed carved from the landscape itself, all quiet plains and weathered textures. He might have been 40, or he might have been 50. The sun and silence had etched lines around his eyes and mouth that told stories of distance, not of time. He was nearly a decade and a half older than the girl who would soon change the course of his life. But at that moment, he was simply a solitary figure defined by what he was not. He was not fidgeting, not sleeping, not engaging in the low, weary chatter that filled the car. He sat with a stillness that was absolute, his long frame folded into the corner by the window, a wide-brimmed hat, its felt stained by rain and alkali dust, was pulled low, shadowing his face and leaving only the firm set of his jaw visible. His hands, covered in worn leather gloves, rested on his knees. They were capable hands, familiar with the heft of an axe and the delicate tension of reins, and they were perfectly still. His duster, the color of dried mud, hung from his broad shoulders, a canvas of his travels. He looked out the grimy window, not at the passing blur of sagebrush and rock, but through it, his gaze fixed on a horizon that only he could see. The other passengers gave him a wide berth. He possessed an aura of quiet containment that discouraged intrusion. He was not threatening, but he was complete in his solitude, a self-contained island in the river of westward-bound humanity. There were prospectors with feverish eyes, a farmer and his gaunt-faced wife herding 3 restless children, a gambler in a slightly too fine coat practicing a coin trick with nimble fingers. They were all moving towards something of promise, a dream, a new beginning. Ezra Holt just seemed to be moving. The train's whistle shrieked, a raw, piercing sound that cut through the oppressive heat. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels slowed, grinding into a long, metallic screech as the locomotive hissed to a stop. It wasn't a town, not even a settlement. It was a water stop, nothing more than a rickety tower and a wide-mouthed tank standing alone in the vast emptiness. A few men swung down from the engine to work the pump, their movements slow and deliberate under the punishing sun. The air in the car grew even more stagnant, the brief illusion of a breeze gone. It was in this sudden, suffocating lull that she appeared. She slipped into the carriage like a ghost, a flicker of desperate motion in the doorway. If she made a sound, it was lost in the sigh of the steam engine. She was young, barely a woman, with a face that should have been soft but was sharpened by fear. Her eyes, wide and the color of a stormy sky, were smudged with dirt and what looked like the ghost of old tears. They darted around the car, not seeing people but assessing threats and obstacles. Her dress, a simple calico print, was torn at the hem and stained with the same red dust as the earth outside. It hung loosely on her thin frame, as if she'd shrunk inside it. But it was the mark on her neck that held the eye, just below her jawline. A sickening, faded bloom of violet and yellow marred her pale skin. It was the distinct, cruel shape of a man's thumbprint, a brand of possession she was now running from. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to make herself small, invisible. Her breath came in shallow, ragged little gasps, like a cornered rabbit's. One of the prospectors grunted and shifted in his seat, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before dismissing her as another piece of wayside misery. The woman with the children pulled her youngest a little closer, her lips thinning in disapproval. To them, the girl was a disruption, a problem they didn't want. Clara felt their eyes on her, each glance a physical touch that made her flinch. She needed to hide. The train would move again soon, but they would be looking for her. The man who'd paid for her, who believed he owned her, would not give up his property so easily. He and his men would be on this train. It was the only way west from that God-forsaken stop. Her panicked gaze swept the car one last time. The gambler, no. His eyes were too sharp, too calculating. He'd sell her out for $1. The family. The mother had already judged her. There was no sanctuary there. Then her eyes landed on the still figure at the very back. Ezra Holt. He hadn't moved. His hat still shadowed his face. He seemed less a man and more a part of the carriage itself, a permanent fixture of leather and shadow. He was large, his duster covering him like a tent. He was a wall she could put between herself and the world. He was her only chance. Gathering a courage she didn't know she possessed, Clara pushed off the wall and moved down the aisle. Her steps were light, almost soundless on the dusty floorboards. She felt 100 eyes on her back, but she kept her focus on the man in the corner, on the sanctuary his size might offer. Each step was a lifetime of risk. When she finally stood beside his seat, her shadow fell over his lap. He didn't look up, but she knew he was aware of her. The stillness about him had changed, shifted from passive observation to a focused, listening quiet. She had to speak, but her throat was tight with terror. Her voice, when it came, was a mere wisp of sound, a dry, rustling whisper that was almost carried away by the hiss of steam from outside. "Sir." She waited. He remained motionless, giving no sign he had heard. She licked her dry lips and tried again, leaning closer, her words aimed at the space beneath the brim of his hat. "Sir, could I hide under your coat?" The plea was a raw, desperate thing, stripped of all pride. It was the last prayer of the hunted. She expected him to refuse, to push her away, to call attention to her. She expected the world to continue being the cruel, unyielding place it had always been. For a long moment, the only sounds were the groaning of the water pump outside and the frantic hummingbird beat of her own heart in her ears. Then, slowly, without a word, without ever looking at her, Ezra Holt moved. One of his gloved hands lifted from his knee and took hold of the left flap of his long duster. He lifted it, creating a dark, cavernous opening between his body and the wall of the train car. It was an answer. Tears of pure, unadulterated relief pricked at Clara's eyes, but she blinked them back. There was no time for weeping. With a final, fearful glance toward the carriage door, she ducked down and slipped into the offered space. She curled herself into the smallest possible ball on the floor, her back pressed against the vibrating wall of the train, her head tucked near his thigh. The heavy fabric of the duster fell back into place, plunging her into a world of near-total darkness. The world outside vanished. The prying eyes, the judging faces, the stark, unforgiving sunlight, all of it was gone. Her new reality was the smell of worn leather, trail dust, and something clean and masculine, like pine soap and open air. It was the solid, unyielding feel of his leg against her shoulder and the rough texture of his trousers against her cheek. It was a close, confined, and utterly safe space. The train whistle blew again, a long, mournful cry. There was a sudden jolt that rattled Clara's teeth, and then the slow, rhythmic clatter of the wheels began once more. They were moving. She was on her way, away. She stayed perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Through the heavy canvas of the coat, she heard the muffled sounds of footsteps in the aisle, the low murmur of voices. Her body went rigid with fear. Were they here? Were they searching for her? She squeezed her eyes shut, praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. And then, through the terror, another sound began to filter into her consciousness. It was a low, steady, rhythmic thud. It was not the sound of the train. It was slower, deeper, more resonant. She shifted her head slightly, her ear pressing against the hard muscle of his thigh, and realized the sound was coming from him. It was traveling through his body, into the floor, into her. It was the steady, unhurried beat of his heart. Thump, 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 thump. It was the calmest sound she had ever heard. It was the rhythm of patience, of strength held in reserve, while her own heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. His beat on with a slow, powerful certainty. It was the heartbeat of a mountain, of an ancient tree, of something that could not be easily moved. Clara closed her eyes, and for the first time in months, she let a single, genuine tear trace a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She was hiding in the dark, at the feet of a complete stranger, a man who hadn't even looked at her face. But as the train carried them deeper into the vast, indifferent desert, she held on to that sound, that steady, life-affirming rhythm. It was an anchor in the chaos, a quiet promise in a world of noise, and for now, it was enough. The steady rhythm of Ezra's heart, which had become Clara's lifeline, was abruptly drowned out by a new sound, the heavy, rhythmic tramp of boots from the connecting car. It was a sound of purpose and menace, and it made the fine hairs on Clara's arms stand up. The low hum of conversation in the carriage faltered and died, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. Through a tiny gap in the fabric of the duster, she could see a slice of the world, the worn floorboards, the spittoon near the aisle, and the dusty boots of the passengers across from them. The door at the far end of the car slammed open, hitting the wall with a crack that made everyone jump. 3 men filled the doorway, blotting out the light. They didn't enter so much as invade, their presence sucking the air from the cramped space. Clara couldn't see their faces, but she didn't need to. She knew the arrogant posture of the man in the lead, the way he surveyed the car as if it were all his property. That was Jedediah Pike. He was a man who dealt in human lives, but he dressed like a gentleman, in a dark wool coat and a polished hat. It was a disguise, meant to lend legitimacy to his vile trade, but the cruelty in his eyes always betrayed him. Flanking him were 2 others, Finn and Bo, hulking shapes of rough-spun cloth and brute force. She could almost smell the cheap whiskey and unwashed sweat on them from her hiding place. "Pardon the intrusion, folks." Pike's voice was smooth, but with an oily quality that slid over the skin and left a chill behind. "Just looking for something of mine that's gone missing. A young lady, about this high, brown hair, likely looking scared. She's my indentured girl. You see, broke her contract." He let the lie hang in the air. Indentured. It was a cleaner word for what she was, a word that made her captivity sound like a business arrangement gone sour. Clara felt a wave of nausea. She pressed her face deeper into the rough fabric of Ezra's trousers, her breath catching in her throat. The heavy boots began their slow march down the aisle. Thump, thump, thump! Each footfall was a hammer blow against Clara's already frayed nerves. She could feel the vibration through the floor, a tremor that seemed to travel right up her spine. Ezra remained perfectly still, a mountain of immovability. But she could feel a change in him. The muscles in his leg were now tense as coiled steel. He wasn't relaxed. He was waiting. "You there?" Bo's voice was a low growl, thick and uneducated. "You seen a girl like that?" A quavering "no, sir," was the reply. "Best be telling the truth," Finn added, his voice higher, nastier. "Mister, Pike don't take kindly to folks who help his property run off." They moved closer. Clara could hear them breathing, could smell the stale tobacco on their clothes. They were 2 seats away. Then 1. Then they were standing right beside them. An eternity seemed to pass in the suffocating darkness of her hiding place. She was convinced they could hear the frantic drumming of her own heart. "What about you, friend?" Pike's voice was dangerously pleasant, directed at Ezra. "You've been mighty quiet this whole trip. See a scared little filly sneak on back at the watering hole?" Clara held her breath, waiting for Ezra's response, but he said nothing. His silence was a defiant act, a wall they could not breach with words. It was more powerful than any denial. "Cat got your tongue," Bo grunted, his impatience growing. His shadow fell over the duster, blocking the thin sliver of light Clara had. "Or maybe you're just tired from traveling. Looks like a heavy coat for a day like this. And then it happened. A thick, grimy hand, its knuckles scarred and dirty, reached down and grabbed the edge of the duster. The material lifted. A sliver of blinding, terrifying light cut into Clara's sanctuary. Her world, for a split second, was the horrifying sight of Beau's leering face peering down. But the light vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The duster fell back into place. There was a sharp intake of breath from Beau, followed by a grunt of pain. Clara didn't know what had happened until she felt the subtle shift of Ezra's body. He had moved. An action so fast and economical it was almost imperceptible. From outside her cocoon, she heard Pike's sharp voice. "Beau, stand down!" There was a tense silence. Clara could picture the scene. Ezra, his face finally revealed from under his hat, his eyes locked on Beau. She could feel the sheer, unadulterated menace radiating from him, a cold, deadly promise that needed no words. "My apologies," Pike said, his tone still smooth but now laced with a thread of caution. "My man is overzealous. We'll leave you to your rest." The heavy footsteps moved away, continuing their search down the rest of the car before crossing into the next. The immediate danger had passed, but Clara was trembling uncontrollably. She felt a deep, bone-rattling chill despite the oppressive heat. They knew. They might not have seen her, but they knew something was wrong. They would be back. It was then that she felt a new sensation. The steady click-clack of the train was slowing, the engine groaning as it began to climb a steep, long grade. The carriage tilted slightly. The world outside the window was no longer a blur, but a crawl of rock and sun-baked sand. Ezra's body shifted again, this time a deliberate movement. He leaned closer, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her, meant for her ears alone. It was the first word he had ever spoken to her, and it was a command. "Jump!" The word was so sudden, so impossible, that her mind couldn't process it. Jump. From a moving train into that wilderness, she must have made a small, questioning sound, a whimper of disbelief. His hand, the one that wasn't covered by a glove, settled on her shoulder. It was calloused and warm, and its grip was firm, leaving no room for argument. He didn't wait for her to understand. In one fluid, powerful motion, Ezra stood, pulling her up with him. He threw the duster open, and Clara was violently expelled from darkness into the blinding, brutal sun. The world was a maelstrom of light, wind, and noise. She had a fleeting impression of the shocked faces of the other passengers, a blur of open mouths and wide eyes. Ezra didn't hesitate. He wrapped one arm around her waist, pulling her tight against his side, and launched them both out of the open door of the carriage. The fall was a chaotic, terrifying tumble. There was no time to scream. The ground rushed up to meet them, a hard, unforgiving slope of sand and sharp gravel. Ezra twisted his body in midair, taking the brunt of the impact himself. They hit the embankment and rolled, a tangle of limbs and flying dust. Clara felt a searing pain as her palms and knees scraped against the rocky earth. The world spun, a dizzying mix of blue sky and red dirt, before they came to a jarring stop at the bottom of a shallow ravine. For a moment, all she could do was lie there, gasping for air, her lungs on fire. The sand was scorchingly hot, even through the thin fabric of her dress. The silence was deafening after the roar of the train, which was already shrinking in the distance. Then came the shouts, faint but clear, and then the sharp crack of a gunshot, the bullet whining harmlessly over their heads, a deadly insect in the vast, empty air. "Up!" Ezra's voice was rough, urgent. He was already on his feet, pulling her up with a strength that belied their fall. "Run, now!" Adrenaline surged through her, overriding the pain. They scrambled up the other side of the ravine, their feet slipping in the loose scree. Ezra set a relentless pace, half dragging her behind him. He moved with a purpose she couldn't fathom, his eyes scanning the terrain, looking for cover in a land that offered none. They were exposed. two small figures against an immense backdrop of rock and sky. The landscape was a brutal maze of canyons and arroyos, thorny mesquite and jagged rock formations that rose from the desert floor like broken teeth. The sun was a physical weight on her shoulders, and every breath was like inhaling fire. Her torn dress caught on every thorny bush, and her flimsy shoes offered no protection against the sharp stones. Behind them, she could hear the faint sounds of pursuit. Pike and his men had jumped from the train as well. They were hunters, and this was their element. Clara's hope began to shrivel in the oppressive heat. They had escaped the cage, only to be trapped in a much larger, deadlier one. Ezra seemed to sense her despair. He didn't slow, but his grip on her hand tightened. "This way." He veered sharply, leading her not across the open ground, but into a narrow, winding crevice between two towering walls of red rock. The temperature dropped a few degrees in the shade, and the sounds of their pursuers became muffled. They were hidden, for now. Clara leaned against the rock wall, her chest heaving, her vision swimming with black spots. I can't," she gasped, the words tearing at her raw throat. Ezra ignored her. He was already working. He pulled a small leather pouch from his belt. From it, he took a small, oily rag and a single lucifer match. He scanned the narrow canyon, his eyes noting the direction of the slight breeze that filtered through the rocks. He moved about 50 yards back toward the entrance of the crevice, to a spot that was visible from the plain below, but around a bend from their current position. He knelt, struck the match on a rock, and touched the flame to the corner of the rag. It caught immediately, producing a thick, greasy black smoke. He let it burn for only a few seconds, long enough to create a distinct plume, then swiftly smothered it with a handful of sand. A thin, dark column of smoke rose into the still air, drifting slowly northward on the breeze. It looked exactly like a signal fire that a lone, careless fugitive might make. He was back at her side in an instant. "They'll see the smoke," he whispered, his voice low and raspy. "They'll think you're alone, panicking. They'll follow it north. We go south." He didn't wait to see if his gamble had paid off. He took her hand again, and they plunged deeper into the rocky labyrinth. Moving away from the false signal, they ran, then walked, then stumbled, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the hunt. Clara's mind was numb with exhaustion and fear. She was running on pure instinct. Her entire world narrowed to the feel of Ezra's calloused hand in hers and the desperate need to keep moving. Hours later, as the sun began its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the canyon, they finally stopped. They were in a small, hidden alcove, shielded from view on all sides. The sounds of pursuit had long since faded. The only sound was the sigh of the wind and their own ragged breathing. The desert was quiet again, but it was no longer a peaceful silence. It was the silence of isolation, of being utterly and completely alone in a vast, unforgiving wilderness. They had escaped, but they were not yet safe. They were just lost in a different way. The journey that followed was a waking nightmare, a long, stumbling passage through a world bleached of color by the moon. The desert, which had been a furnace by day, became a place of biting, insidious cold. The rocks bled their stored heat into the night air, leaving the ground frigid. Clara's thin dress was no match for the chill, and a deep, shuddering tremor took root in her bones. She moved because Ezra moved, a half-conscious automaton tethered to the quiet, dark shape ahead of her. Ezra navigated the treacherous landscape with an assurance that was baffling. He seemed to read the terrain by starlight, his path weaving through canyons and over ridges with an unhesitating purpose. He said nothing, but his presence was a constant, solid anchor. Once, when she stumbled, her ankle twisting painfully, his hand shot out to steady her before she could fall. He allowed her a moment to catch her breath, then tugged her hand gently, urging her onward. He was not unkind, but he was relentless. Survival was a forward-moving thing, and he would not let them stop. Clara lost all track of time. Her world shrank to the scuffed heels of Ezra's boots and the burning ache in her own lungs. The fear that had propelled her earlier had burned away, leaving behind a hollow, aching exhaustion. She was a vessel emptied of everything but the will to take one more step. It was in the deepest, darkest hour before dawn, when the stars shone with a cold, brittle light, that he finally led her to what looked like a sheer wall of rock, a dead end in the labyrinthine canyon. Despair, cold and sharp, pierced through her fatigue. Had he led her here to die? But Ezra walked directly toward the cliff face, disappearing into a shadow so deep it seemed to be a physical hole in the world. He reappeared a moment later, his hand extended to her from the darkness. It was not a wall, but an entrance, a narrow fissure in the rock, barely wide enough for a horse to pass through. He guided her into the passage, and they walked for another 100 yards in near total blackness, the rock walls close on either side. When they emerged, the world had changed. They were in a small, self-contained valley, a box canyon shielded on all sides by towering walls of red sandstone. The air here was still and smelled of dust, pine, and damp earth. The first pale gray light of dawn was beginning to seep over the canyon rim, illuminating a sight that made Clara's heart stand still. It was a home. It wasn't much. A small cabin, built of thick, weathered logs the color of silver, sat nestled against the western wall of the canyon. Its roof was patched with tin, and a thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney, a fragile ribbon against the waking sky. A little ways off stood a barn, its timbers leaning with age and its roof sagging in the middle. Beside the cabin was a small, fenced vegetable garden, the plants looking hardy and determined. A stone-lined well, with a simple bucket and pulley system, stood like a sentinel near the front porch. The entire place had an air of quiet tenacity, of having been wrested from the unforgiving land and held on to through sheer force of will. As they drew closer, the cabin door creaked open. A small figure emerged, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. It was a boy, no older than 7, with a thatch of unruly brown hair and wearing a simple homespun shirt and trousers that were a little too short for him. He saw Ezra, and a wide, sleepy grin split his face. "Ezra!" The boy ran toward them, his bare feet kicking up little puffs of dust. He launched himself at Ezra, who, to Clara's astonishment, caught him effortlessly, swinging him up into his arms. The hard lines of the cowboy's face softened, a warmth appearing in his eyes that she had not known was possible. All the weariness and grim focus of the trail seemed to fall away from him in that moment. "Mornin', Isaac." Ezra's voice was a low, gentle rumble. He set the boy down, his hand resting on his head. It was then that Isaac's gaze fell on Clara. His smile vanished, replaced by a wide-eyed, solemn curiosity. He took a small step back, half hiding behind Ezra's leg, his eyes fixed on her torn dress and scratched face. He wasn't afraid, merely cautious, the way a wild creature is when faced with something new and unknown. Ezra looked from the boy to Clara, and his expression was unreadable. "Isaac," he said, his voice calm and even. "This is Clara. She's had a long journey. She'll be staying with us for a spell." He offered no other explanation, and the boy asked for none. Isaac considered her for another long moment, his young face serious. Then he gave a small, decisive nod, as if he had settled some important matter in his own mind. He stepped out from behind Ezra, walked over to Clara, and held out his hand. In his palm was a perfectly smooth, white stone, worn by water and time. He didn't speak, just offered it to her. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. It was a simple, childish gesture, but it was the first act of unconditional welcome she had received in longer than she could remember. Her hand trembled as she reached out and took the small, cool stone from him. She tried to say thank you, but the word caught in her throat, a knot of unshed emotion. She could only manage a shaky smile. Ezra watched the exchange, then gestured toward the cabin. "Let's get you inside." The interior of the cabin was one large room, dominated by a massive stone hearth where a low fire crackled merrily. The air was warm and smelled of bacon and brewing coffee. A rough-hewn table and 2 benches stood in the center of the room. The space was sparse, furnished only with what was necessary, but it was meticulously clean. It was a man's space, but it was a home. Ezra pointed to a closed door in the far wall. "You can have the small room. It's not much, but it's private." He then turned to the hearth. "There's water for washing. Isaac and I have chores to see to. Rest." Clara nodded, unable to speak. She walked to the small room and opened the door. It was little more than an alcove, containing a narrow cot with a clean, patched quilt, a small crate for a bedside table, and a single high window. But it had a door, a solid wooden door that she could close. She shut it gently behind her, the soft click of the latch echoing in the quiet room. She leaned her back against the wood, her legs suddenly unable to support her. The little white stone was still clutched in her hand, its smoothness a strange comfort. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she was in a room with a closed door that no one would kick open. She was in a place where she had been offered a kindness instead of a threat. She didn't bother to wash. She simply stumbled to the cot and collapsed onto it. The quilt was rough against her cheek, but it was clean. She could hear the low murmur of Ezra's voice and the higher pitch of Isaac's from the main room, the simple, domestic sounds of a life being lived. The exhaustion she had held at bay for so long washed over her in a great, irresistible wave. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in more months than she could count, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the sleep of the truly safe. She woke to late morning sunlight streaming through the high window, painting a golden bar across the far wall. The cabin was quiet. For a confused, panicked moment, she thought it had all been a dream. The chase, the cowboy, the boy, the hidden home. But then she smelled the lingering scent of wood smoke and coffee, and she felt the smooth, hard shape of the white stone still clutched in her hand. She sat up, her body a symphony of aches and pains. She felt fragile, raw, but beneath the pain was a feeling she couldn't name. It was the absence of fear. She crept out of her room into the main cabin. It was empty. Through the open door, she could see Ezra in the corral, mending a leather strap on a saddle, his movements patient and precise. Isaac was nearby, diligently practicing with a small slingshot, aiming at a tin can perched on a fence post. They were working. They had a life here, a rhythm. She was an intruder, a piece of flotsam washed up on their shores. The peace she felt was borrowed, and the feeling of being a burden, of being useless, was a familiar, heavy cloak. She couldn't bear it. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for something to do. A bucket filled with freshly picked carrots and potatoes sat by the door. Without a second thought, she carried it outside to the well. She drew up a bucket of clear, cold water and poured it into a basin. She sat on the edge of the porch and began to wash the vegetables, her hands scrubbing the rich, dark earth from their skins. The task was simple: grounding. The cold water on her scraped hands, the repetitive motion, the tangible result of a clean pile of food. It was real. It was something she could control in a life that had been utterly without her control. When the vegetables were done, she found a worn-out broom leaning against the cabin wall and began to sweep the dust from the porch. The rhythmic scrape and whisk of the bristles was a calming sound. Her hands searched for work because her mind did not yet dare to believe it was living, not just hiding. Each sweep of the broom, each washed potato, was a small act of claiming a moment of existence. It was her saying, in the only way she knew how, that she was still here. From the corral, Ezra watched her. He had seen her emerge from the cabin, had watched her find the vegetables and the broom. He didn't speak, didn't offer to help, didn't acknowledge her in any way. He simply continued his work, his hands never ceasing their methodical mending of the leather. But he saw, and in his quiet, observant silence, there was a profound and unspoken understanding. He was giving her the space to find her own footing in this strange new piece. He was letting her work, because he knew that for someone who had been running for so long, the hardest thing in the world was learning how to stand still. The days that followed her arrival settled into a rhythm as quiet and steady as Ezra's heartbeat. Time in the hidden canyon was not measured by the hands of a clock, but by the slow, deliberate crawl of shadows across the sandstone walls. It was a life stripped down to its essential elements: the rising sun, the drawing of water, the tending of the small garden, the setting sun, and the deep, profound silence that held it all. For Clara, who had known only the chaotic noise of fear and the harsh demands of captors, this quiet was a foreign language she had to learn. Her teacher was Ezra, and his lessons were taught without a single spoken word. At first, his silence was a void she tried to fill with work. She scrubbed the cabin's plank floors until the wood gleamed, patched Isaac's worn trousers with tiny, meticulous stitches, and learned the precise amount of cornmeal to add to the morning gruel. She worked with a desperate, feverish energy, as if her usefulness were the only rent she could pay for her safety. She did not speak unless spoken to, and, since Ezra rarely spoke, a blanket of quiet often enveloped the three of them. Isaac was the bridge. He chattered enough for all of them, a lively brook of questions and observations that flowed around the two silent stones of the adults. He would bring Clara a horned lizard held carefully in his cupped hands, his face alight with discovery. He would ask her if she knew why the sky was blue, or if she could whistle a tune like the meadowlarks that nested in the canyon cliffs. Clara would answer him in a voice that was soft and hesitant, a voice she barely recognized as her own. Ezra would listen to these exchanges from across the room or the yard, his face impassive, but Clara began to notice a subtle softening in his eyes when she spoke kindly to the boy. Slowly, she began to understand that Ezra's quiet was not an absence of thought, but a different form of communication. It was a language of action, of observation, of quiet provision. She started to see it in the small things. One afternoon, she was determined to cook the evening meal on her own. She made a simple stew of rabbit and vegetables, seasoning it with wild herbs she and Isaac had gathered. Her hands trembled as she ladled a portion into Ezra's bowl and set it before him at the rough-hewn table. She retreated to her own seat, her stomach in knots, unable to eat until she saw his reaction. He took the bowl without looking at her, his expression as unreadable as ever. He lifted the spoon to his lips, tasted the stew, and chewed slowly. For a long moment, he just looked down at his bowl. Clara's heart sank. It was bland, tasteless. She had failed this simple test. But then, just before he took a second spoonful, he lifted his head. His gaze met hers across the table for a fleeting, powerful second. He gave a single, short nod. That was all. It wasn't praise. It wasn't effusive thanks. It was a simple, profound acknowledgement. I see your effort. It is sufficient. For a girl who had only been seen as property or a problem, to be truly seen in this quiet, respectful way felt like a balm on a wound she didn't know she had. She finally picked up her own spoon and began to eat, the stew tasting like the most satisfying meal of her life. A few days later, she was helping Isaac fetch firewood from a pile stacked against the canyon wall. Her footing slipped on a loose rock, and she threw out a hand to catch herself, scraping her palm raw against the sharp edge of a log. It was a clumsy, foolish mistake. The cut stung, bleeding freely, and she quickly wrapped it in the hem of her skirt, hiding it from view. She was used to hiding her pain, used to being punished for any sign of weakness or imperfection. She said nothing of it when they returned to the cabin. That evening, after the chores were done, she went to sit on the front porch steps. cradling her throbbing hand in her lap as she watched the first stars appear in the deepening twilight. The air grew cool, and she eventually went back inside to the warmth of the fire. An hour later, needing a drink of water, she returned to the porch. There, on the exact step where she had been sitting, was a small tin of dark, pungent salve and a strip of clean, white linen, neatly folded. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. He had been in the barn when she fell. He couldn't have seen it, and yet he must have noticed the way she held her hand, or seen the flicker of pain in her eyes. He hadn't confronted her, hadn't made her feel clumsy or foolish by pointing out her injury. He had simply observed, understood, and provided the remedy, leaving it for her to find in private. He had respected her pride, even as he tended to her wound. She took the items back to her small room, and in the flickering candlelight, she carefully cleaned and dressed the cut, her movements slow and reverent. It was more than a bandage. It was a message. You are seen. You are cared for. As the days shortened and the desert nights grew colder, another lesson unfolded. The main room of the cabin was always warm from the fire, but a draft snaked in from under the door, chilling the floor. Clara had taken to sitting in a particular straight-backed chair, often tucking her feet up beneath her to keep them warm. One evening, she came in from securing the chicken coop to find a thick, folded sheepskin, the one Ezra usually kept on his own saddle, draped over the seat and back of her chair. He was already seated at the table, mending a bridle, and he didn't look up as she entered. He offered no explanation. He didn't need to. He had noticed her shivering the night before. He had seen her discomfort and, without a word, had taken a piece of his own comfort and given it to her. She ran her hand over the thick, soft wool, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. The most profound lesson, however, came on a night when the sky broke open. A storm rolled into the canyon without warning, a furious onslaught of wind and rain that turned the quiet sanctuary into a roaring, chaotic place. The wind howled through the rocks, a mournful, angry sound that rattled the very logs of the cabin. Rain came down in blinding sheets, drumming against the roof like 1,000 frantic fists. Clara lay on her cot in her small, dark room, her body tense, every muscle coiled tight. The storm was a terrifying echo of the chaos she had fled. The violent, unpredictable noise reminded her of slamming doors, of angry, shouting men, of a world where safety was a fragile illusion that could be shattered at any moment. The wooden shutter over her small window, not fully latched, was caught by the wind. It began to bang against the outside wall with a series of sharp, violent cracks that sounded like gunshots in the night. Crack, bang, crack! Each sound was a physical blow. She pulled the thin quilt up to her chin, her knuckles white, her heart hammering against her ribs. She squeezed her eyes shut, but she could still see the face of Jedediah Pike, still feel the terror of the chase. Then, through the roar of the storm, she heard the scrape of a bench in the main room, followed by the soft, heavy tread of Ezra's boots. Her heart leapt into her throat. Was he angry about the noise? Was he coming to yell at her, to blame her for the loose shutter? That was the only world she knew. But the footsteps didn't come to her door. They went to the main cabin door, which groaned open and then slammed shut against the wind. He had gone outside, into the heart of the storm. Confused, she slipped off the cot and crept to her door, opening it just a crack. It was too dark to see anything in the main room. She moved to the window, peering through the small gap between the shutter and the frame, in the brilliant, momentary flashes of lightning that illuminated the canyon. She saw him. Ezra was out in the driving rain, his back to her, his shoulders hunched against the wind. He was soaked, his shirt plastered to his back, but his movements were steady and unhurried. He worked patiently with a piece of rope, his gloved hands moving with practiced efficiency as he wrestled the flailing shutter into submission. He tested the knot, making sure it was secure, before finally turning away. He didn't glance toward her window. He didn't seem to be aware of her at all. He simply melted back into the darkness toward the front of the cabin. A moment later, she heard the main door open and close again. The violent banging stopped. Her room was plunged back into a quiet, broken only by the steady, soothing drum of rain on the now secure roof. Clara stood by the window for a long time, her hand pressed against the rough wood of the wall. She listened to the storm, but it no longer sounded threatening. It was just weather. Outside her room, her small, safe space. A man had walked into the fury of the night, not for himself, but for her. He had faced the storm to quiet her fears. He hadn't asked for anything. He hadn't demanded her gratitude. He likely would never speak of it. It was an act of pure, unadorned protection. In her past, every kindness from a man had been a hook, a down payment for something he would later claim from her. A gift was just a prettier kind of chain. But this was different. This was a gift with no strings attached. A new feeling rose up in her, warm and powerful. A feeling she had never known, had never even had a name for. It was the feeling of being truly safe, of being protected, not because she was a possession to be guarded, but because she was a person worthy of peace. Lying back down on her cot, listening to the gentle rain, Clara finally understood the language of Ezra's silence. It wasn't empty. It was full of a quiet, steady strength and a profound, unspoken kindness. And in that quiet, for the first time in her life, she felt free. The canyon had become her sanctuary, and its quiet rhythms had begun to seep into her bones. The frantic, hunted look in her eyes had softened, replaced by a watchful calm. She had learned the language of the sun and the shadows, the cry of the hawk that circled the high cliffs, and the silent, steady language of the man who had given her this peace. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. The brutal heat of summer gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. The small cottonwood trees that lined the canyon's seasonal creek turned a brilliant, defiant yellow. Life with Ezra and Isaac was a routine of shared, quiet labor. She had taken over the cooking, finding a strange solace in the methodical chopping of vegetables and the kneading of dough. Her hands, once soft and then scraped raw by her escape, were now becoming capable, calloused in new places from the handle of the water bucket and the garden hoe. She was healing, not just from her physical ordeal, but in a deeper, more fundamental way. The safety Ezra provided was so absolute, so undemanding, that it created a space for the ghosts of her past to finally surface. And one ghost was larger than all the others. It was a bright, cool morning. Isaac was down by the creek, engrossed in some grand, solitary adventure with a fleet of twig boats. The air was still, and the only sounds were the distant chirping of the boy, the gentle nicker of a horse in the corral, and the rhythmic, scraping sound of Ezra sharpening a knife. He sat on the porch steps, his back straight, the long blade of a skinning knife held in one hand and a whetstone in the other. His movements were hypnotic, a slow, steady draw of steel over stone. Shh, shh, shh. It was the sound of patience, of maintenance, of a quiet readiness for whatever the world might bring. Clara stood in the doorway of the cabin, a dish towel in her hands, twisting the fabric into a knot. She had been watching him for several minutes, her heart aflutter with a nervous energy she couldn't quell. She had felt it building for days, this need to speak, to offer the one truth she had been guarding like a shard of broken glass. Here, in this place of quiet honesty, her secret felt like a lie. She felt she owed him the truth, but she was terrified of what that truth might do to the fragile peace between them. In the world she had been dragged through, her innocence was a commodity. It was the centerpiece of the bargain Jedediah Pike had made. It was the sole reason he had hunted her with such fury she was a stolen treasure, an investment he had not yet collected upon. How would Ezra see it? Would this good, quiet man look at her and see only a damaged thing, a reminder of the sordid world of men like Pike, or worse? Would he think she was offering him what another man had failed to take, laying her last and only value at his feet? The thought sent a chill of shame through her. But the memory of him securing her shudder in the storm, of the salve left on the step, of the sheepskin on her chair, these small, silent kindnesses gave her a sliver of courage. He was not like other men. She had to believe that. She took a deep breath that did little to calm the frantic beat of her heart and stepped out onto the porch. The rhythmic scraping of the knife stopped. Ezra didn't look up, but his hands stilled. He was listening. She didn't walk toward him, but stood by the doorpost, her gaze fixed on a loose floorboard. Her voice, when it finally came, was thin and reedy, a pale imitation of its usual sound. "Ezra!" He waited. The silence stretched, vast and intimidating. She forced herself to continue, the words tasting like rust in her mouth. I needed to tell you something about that man, Mr. Pike." She couldn't bring herself to look at him, couldn't bear to see the judgment that might dawn on his face. He had made a purchase. He paid my stepfather a great sum. The words were stark, ugly. She felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. She was laying the sordid facts of her life at his feet, dirtying his clean, quiet world with her past. "He was taking me to a house in Santa Fe." She swallowed hard. The next words, the most difficult of all. He had not yet. I ran before he could." She took one more shaky breath, and finally pushed out the core of it, the word that had defined and haunted her. "I'm a virgin." The confession hung in the crisp autumn air, fragile and terrible. In the ringing silence that followed, the only sound was a faint breeze rustling the yellow leaves of the cottonwoods. The world seemed to be holding its breath. Ezra did not move. He did not turn. He did not look at her. His gaze remained on the knife in his hands, his face a mask of concentration, shadowed by the brim of his hat. For one awful, agonizing moment, she thought he would simply ignore her, that her confession was so distasteful he would pretend it never happened. That would have been worse than anger. Then he moved. It was a small, almost imperceptible motion. He dipped his head once, a short, sharp nod of acknowledgement. He had heard. He understood. And he was not turning away. The silent acceptance was so profound, so much more than she had dared to hope for, that it broke something open inside her. It gave her the courage to voice the deeper, more terrifying fear that lay beneath the confession. This wasn't just about her past. It was about her future. It was about him. Her voice trembled, thick with unshed tears. I only say it because if there is ever a time between us," she faltered, the implication of her words hanging nakedly in the air. She was talking about intimacy, about a possibility that she could barely let herself imagine, a future where she might not be alone. She forced herself to finish, the plea a raw whisper. "I would ask that you please be patient." She finally risked a glance at him. He still hadn't moved, his posture unchanged. He remained a still silhouette against the bright morning. She had laid her past, her present, and her possible future at his feet, a fragile, trembling offering. She had given him all the power. He let the silence sit for a moment longer, letting her words settle. Then he spoke. His voice was not soft or gentle. It was as low and steady as the bedrock of the canyon itself. It was a statement of fact, a truth as solid and unyielding as the whetstone in his hand. "Patience is my craft." After he spoke, he lifted the knife and, with the same deliberate, unhurried motion as before, he drew the blade across the stone. Shk, shk, shk. The sound resumed. The world started turning again, the rhythm of their quiet life, which her confession had threatened to shatter, was restored. Unbroken, but something had fundamentally changed. Clara leaned against the doorpost, a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees. She watched him work, the steady, rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, and she finally understood. Jedediah Pike had seen her purity as a price tag. It was an object, a seal on a product that proved its value. He would have claimed it with the impatient, brutish entitlement of a man collecting on a debt. His goal was the destination, the conquest. Ezra's response revealed a completely different worldview. Patience is my craft. It was the creed of his entire existence. It was the patience of a man who could track a deer for 2 days, who could gentle a wild horse not by breaking it but by waiting for it to offer its trust. It was the patience of a man who could plant seeds in the hard desert soil and wait for the rain, who could sit in silence and simply observe the world without needing to conquer it. He wasn't talking about waiting for a prize. He was talking about the process. He was telling her that he understood that some things of value, trust, healing, intimacy could not be taken, only earned. They had to be cultivated with the same slow, steady care he used for everything else in his life. And in that moment, the most profound realization of all washed over her. He did not value her for the thing that had almost been stolen. He did not see her worth in her untouched state. He had stopped Pike's man on the train, had jumped into the desert, had led her here and protected her, all without knowing that fact. His quiet respect, his unspoken care, had never been conditional on her purity. He valued her for something else entirely. He valued the girl who had been brave enough to run, the girl who had scrambled onto a train with nothing but terror in her heart, the girl who had survived. He didn't see her as a fragile treasure to be guarded. He saw her as a fellow survivor. The thing Pike had tried to buy was incidental, the part of her that Ezra respected. The part his patience would be offered to was the fierce, resilient spirit that could never be bought or sold. She watched him for another moment, the sunlight catching the silver of his blade as it moved back and forth, back and forth. For the first time, Clara felt no shame. The brand of her past was not a mark of value or of damage. It was simply a part of the story of how she had survived. And she was standing on the porch of a man who understood, better than anyone, the craft of survival. Following her confession, the air in the canyon did not become heavy or awkward as Clara had feared. Instead, it became clearer. A tension she hadn't even been fully aware of had dissolved, leaving behind a silence that was no longer just peaceful, but deeply resonant. By offering Ezra the most vulnerable part of her story, she had given him a trust he had already earned, and his simple, profound acceptance had forged a new kind of bond between them. It was a bond that had no need for words. It was tended to in the quiet, shared spaces of their daily lives. Love, Clara learned, was not a grand declaration. It was a rhythm. It was the steady, comforting routine they built, day by patient day, a fortress of normalcy against the chaos of the outside world. Her days took on a shape defined by domestic tasks she had never known. She learned the particular cluck a hen makes just before it lays, the cautious, patient way one must reach beneath the warm, feathered body to retrieve the prize. At first, her hands had been timid, but Isaac, with the fearless confidence of a child, showed her how. And soon the basket of brown and pale blue eggs she brought in each morning felt like a treasure she had won. She learned the alchemy of the kitchen. Her first few loaves of bread were dense, heavy things that could have been used to chock a wagon wheel. But Ezra ate every slice without a word of complaint, his jaw working methodically. Then, one afternoon, as she struggled with a sticky, uncooperative dough, he came inside, washed his hands at the basin, and stood beside her. He didn't speak. He simply reached over, dusted his own hands with flour, and gently guided hers, showing her the proper way to fold and turn the dough. A silent lesson in pressure and touch. The next loaf she baked rose high and golden, its crust crisp, its center light and airy, when she cut into it, filling the cabin with its warm, wholesome scent. The quiet nod he gave her from across the room was more rewarding than a symphony of praise. She took to mending Isaac's clothes in the evenings by the firelight. She patched the knees of his trousers where he'd worn them through with his adventures, and sewed buttons back onto his shirts. These small acts of repair felt deeply symbolic. She was stitching together the small tears in their world, weaving herself, thread by careful thread, into the fabric of this unlikely family. She was no longer just a refugee being sheltered. She was a contributor, a caretaker, a part of the whole. While she cultivated a life within the cabin's walls, Ezra tended to the world outside. His days were a testament to his creed, patience is my craft. He worked with a steady, unhurried diligence that was mesmerizing to watch. He re-shingled the sagging roof of the barn, each piece of cedar placed with precision. He spent days patiently working a piece of stiff leather until it was soft and pliable enough to repair his saddle, his hands moving with an artisan's skill, and every few days, the canyon would echo with the sharp, clean ring of his axe as he split firewood, stacking it in a neat, formidable wall against the coming cold. His labor was the silent, sturdy framework that held their world together. Their lives were parallel lines of work that, more and more often, began to intersect in small, meaningful ways. These intersections became their conversation, a language of gestures more intimate than any spoken words. One afternoon, while walking with Isaac along the creek bed, Clara spotted it, a single, defiant desert marigold growing in a sliver of soil between two large rocks. It was a splash of brilliant, impossible yellow against the muted reds and browns of the canyon. It was so fragile, and yet so resilient, a small testament to the life that could flourish in the harshest of places. It reminded her of the feeling that was beginning to bloom in her own chest, a delicate, hopeful thing she didn't yet dare to name. On impulse, she picked it. That evening, after Ezra had cleaned his tools and gone inside, she crept out to the porch and placed the small, bright flower on the railing next to his whetstone. It was a foolish, childish gesture, and she was immediately mortified. What would he think? That she was a silly girl leaving weeds about. She fully expected it to be gone in the morning, swept away with the dust. The next day, it was indeed gone. A small, sharp pang of disappointment struck her. He had probably not even noticed it. Or if he had, he'd simply brushed it aside. Later that morning, however, Ezra was called away to the corral in a hurry to fix a gate a stubborn horse had rattled loose. He had been at the table, working in a small, leather-bound journal where he kept accounts and notes, and he left it lying open. As Clara went to clear the table, she saw it, there, pressed carefully between a page of neatly written figures and a list of supplies, was her marigold. He had taken her small, impulsive offering of beauty, and had chosen to preserve it, to make it a permanent part of his world. Clara touched the fragile of flattened petals with the tip of her finger, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the morning sun. He had heard her, even when she hadn't spoken. She began to look for ways to speak his language, to answer his silent acts of care with her own. She noticed how, after a long afternoon of splitting wood, he would come to the porch and sit for a moment, his shoulders slumped with fatigue. Before coming inside, the sun would still be hot in the late afternoon, and his face would be slick with sweat and streaked with dust. One such day, she drew a tin cup of the coldest water from the well, the condensation beating on its sides. She added a small, bruised sprig of mint from the tiny herb patch she'd started near the kitchen door. She carried it outside and, without a word, set it on the porch railing beside the spot where he always sat. She then retreated back into the cool of the cabin before he returned. From the window, she watched him approach. He saw the cup immediately. He stopped, his gaze lingering on it for a long moment. He slowly reached out, picked it up, and drank the entire cupful in long, slow swallows. He didn't look toward the cabin, didn't give any sign that he knew she was watching, but when he was finished, he held the empty cup in his hand for a second longer before setting it down, a gesture that felt as profound as a thank you. His reply came that evening. The straight-backed wooden chair she favored by the fire had begun to feel harder as the days of physical labor took their toll on her. She often found herself shifting, trying to find a comfortable position for her aching back, while she was tending to the stew simmering over the hearth. She heard a slight movement behind her, When she returned to her seat, she found a small, firm pillow, sewn from a clean grain sack and stuffed with what felt like soft grasses and downy feathers. Propped against the base of the chair, it fit perfectly into the small of her back. She sank into the chair, the pillow offering a comfort so perfect, so precisely what she needed, that it was all she could do not to weep. It was a conversation, clear as day. You saw my thirst and brought me coolness. I saw your weariness and bring you softness. No one said I love you. The words would have felt too loud, too clumsy for the delicate, hand-woven tapestry they were creating. Love wasn't a word. It was a basket of warm eggs on a cool morning. It was a perfectly risen loaf of bread. It was a mended tear in a small boy's trousers. It was a cup of cold water left on a porch rail. It was a flower pressed between the pages of a journal. It was a pillow, handmade and perfectly placed. Love was the shared, contented silence by the fire in the evenings, with Isaac asleep in his small bed. It was the way Ezra's eyes would sometimes linger on her for a moment longer than necessary. It was the way her heart would give a small, happy leap when she heard his footsteps approaching the cabin. It was born and nurtured in the space between them, in the thousand small, unspoken gestures that said, I see you. Your comfort matters to me. Your world is my world. In the quiet of the canyon, sheltered from the cruelties of the world. Love didn't need to be spoken. It simply was. It grew, like the stubborn desert marigold, in a place no one else could see. A fragile, resilient, and breathtakingly beautiful thing. The season turned, and the fierce yellow of the cottonwoods deepened to a brittle gold. The peace in the canyon had become so profound, so much a part of Clara's own breathing, that the memory of Jedediah Pike had begun to feel like a story that had happened to someone else. The world of men with cruel hands and cold eyes was a distant, hazy nightmare, kept at bay by the towering sandstone walls and the quiet, steady presence of the man who worked beside her. The morning of the storm's return began like any other. The air was cool and clean, and the sun cast long, gentle shadows from the eastern rim of the canyon. Isaac was down by the corral, talking earnestly to one of the horses, his small voice a cheerful, rambling monologue. Clara was humming a half-forgotten tune as she kneaded dough inside the cabin, the rhythmic push and pull of her hands a comforting meditation. Ezra was out of sight, having ridden out at dawn to check the snares he kept in the higher passes, a task he undertook every few weeks. It was the horses that gave the first warning. They grew restless in the corral, their ears twitching, their heads lifting to scent the wind. A moment later, Isaac came running toward the cabin, his face puckered with confusion. "Clara," he said, his voice a worried whisper as he burst through the door. "There are men coming." Clara's hands froze in the dough. A cold, metallic dread washed through her, so sudden and so absolute it stole her breath. "What men, Isaac?" she asked, her voice tight. "I don't know," he said, his eyes wide. "They ain't from around here?" She rushed to the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. Peering around the edge of the curtain, she saw them, 3 riders, just emerging from the narrow fissure that served as the canyon's only entrance. The sun glinted off the barrel of a rifle, and the man in the lead, sitting his horse with an arrogant, proprietary air, was a figure seared into her memory. Jedediah Pike. He had found them. The impossible had happened. The sanctuary had been breached. For a single, paralyzing second, she could not move. Her blood turned to ice in her veins. He had found her. The chase was not over. Then, a sound cut through her terror, the sound of Isaac's frightened, shallow breathing beside her. He was looking at her, his small face pale, seeking reassurance she did not have. And in that instant, something shifted inside her. The hunted animal gave way to the cornered mother. This was not just her life at stake anymore. It was Isaac's. It was this home. It was the quiet, precious world they had built. "Isaac," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Get in my room, under the cot, now. Do not make a sound." He obeyed without question, his small face a mask of fear. Clara turned, her mind racing. Ezra. Where was Ezra? He was out of earshot, too far away to help. She was alone, she and the boy. A wave of pure, undiluted terror threatened to drown her, but she pushed it down. She thought of Ezra, of his quiet strength, his unyielding patience. What would he do? He would be calm. He would be ready. Her eyes fell on the heavy iron bar Ezra used to bolt the door at night. Her hands, clumsy with fear, fumbled with the latch, dropping it into place just as the riders pulled up in front of the cabin. The heavy thud of the bar sliding home was a small, defiant sound against the impending doom. "Clara, girl." Pike's voice was a lazy, confident drawl from outside. It was a sound that made her skin crawl. "I know you're in there. Been a long and tiresome journey to find you. You've cost me a considerable amount of time and money. Open this door." She pressed her back against the door, as if her small weight could somehow reinforce it. She didn't answer. "Don't be foolish." His voice hardened. "There's nowhere left to run. We can do this easy, or we can do this hard. The choice is yours. But either way, I'm coming in." There was a moment of silence. Then the sound of dismounting, the crunch of boots on the dry earth. She heard the low, brutal laughter of his men, Finn and Bo. "Maybe she needs some encouragement. Mr. Pike," came Bo's gravelly voice. "Perhaps so," Pike replied. Then his voice rose to a shout. "I'll give you to the count of 3. Girl 1. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, her mind a blank wall of panic. 2. And then another sound, a sound so unexpected, so welcome. It was like a prayer answered, the sound of a single horse, ridden hard, coming down the canyon from the opposite direction. Ezra. "Well now." Pike's voice was laced with surprise. "Looks like we have company." Clara flew back to the window. Ezra had just rounded the bend, his horse at a full gallop. He saw the 3 men and their horses in his yard, and he reined in so hard his mount reared, its hooves pawing at the air. He didn't reach for the rifle in his scabbard. His eyes were locked on the cabin, on the barred door. He knew she was inside. "That your man, girl?" Pike called out, his voice dripping with amusement. "Looks like he's a bit outnumbered." Ezra swung down from his horse, his movements fluid and economical. He stood alone in the yard, facing the 3 of them. He was 100 feet from the cabin, 100 feet from her. His face, even from this distance, was a mask of cold, deadly fury. "This is my property." Ezra's voice was a low growl that carried across the yard, a sound Clara had never heard before. "You are not welcome here. Leave now." Pike chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "I think not. You see, the girl in that cabin is my property, and I've come to collect her." In that instant, everything happened at once. Bo and Finn drew their pistols, moving to flank Ezra. But Ezra wasn't looking at them. His eyes were on the cabin door. "Clara!" he roared, a single desperate command. "Stay inside!" Then he charged, not at the men, but at the cabin. It was an act of pure, insane desperation. He was trying to get to her, to put himself between her and them. Finn and Bo were caught off guard by the move, raising their pistols to fire. But Ezra was already a blur of motion. He reached the porch in a matter of seconds, his hand going for the door latch, forgetting in his haste that she had barred it. He slammed against the solid wood. His momentum stopped. He was trapped outside with them. "Get him!" Pike snarled. Bo was the first to reach him, swinging the butt of his pistol in a vicious arc. Ezra turned, catching the man's wrist, and the 2 of them became a tangle of limbs, grunts, and the sickening thud of fists on flesh. Finn moved in, trying to get a clear shot. Pike stood back, a cruel smile on his face, watching the show. Clara watched, horrified, through the window. It was a brutal, one-sided fight. Ezra was strong, but he was unarmed, and there were two of them. He fought with a silent, savage efficiency, but they were pressing him, forcing him back against the wall of the cabin. She had to do something. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on the rifle Ezra kept mounted above the fireplace. It was an old, heavy plains rifle. She had seen him clean it, had seen him load it, but she had never touched it in her life. The thought of it terrified her. It was a tool of violence, of death. Then she heard a pained cry from outside. Ezra's voice. Bo had landed a blow, and Ezra had staggered. That sound broke through her fear. In a single, decisive motion, she ran to the fireplace, her hands reaching up, her fingers closing around the cold, heavy wood and steel of the rifle. It was heavier than she had imagined. Awkward, alien. She fumbled with it, nearly dropping it, before she managed to get it off the hooks. She checked the hammer, just as she had seen Ezra do 100 times. It was loaded. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold it steady. She crept back to the window. The scene outside had grown worse. Ezra was on one knee, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. Finn had him covered with his pistol while Bo kicked at him, his laughter a harsh, ugly sound. "Had enough, Cowboy," Bo grunted, aiming another kick at Ezra's ribs. "That's enough," Pike said, finally stepping forward. "We need him able to tell us where he keeps his money." He looked toward the cabin door. "Break it down. Get the girl." Bo grinned and turned his attention to the door. He raised his heavy boot to kick it in. The world narrowed for Clara. There was no time to think. There was only the image of that door splintering, of that brutal man reaching for her. For Isaac. She raised the rifle, the heavy stock clumsy against her shoulder. She tried to aim through the window, but her hands were shaking too much. Bo's boot crashed against the door. The wood groaned, but the bar held. He cursed and drew back for another, harder kick. Clara knew she couldn't wait. She moved to the door, pressing her cheek against the wood, the rifle clutched in her hands. She could hear them just outside, their breathing, their cursing. The terror was a living thing in her throat, choking her, but beneath it was a cold, hard rage. They would not have this home. They would not have this boy. They would not have this man. Bo's boot struck the door again. Harder this time. A crack appeared in the wood. On the next kick, the bar would break. And in that moment, the door was no longer her shield. It was her cage. Ezra was out there, alone. With a cry that was half sob, half roar, Clara lifted the heavy bar from its brackets. She threw the door open and stumbled onto the porch, the massive rifle held out in front of her. The three men froze, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. They saw a slip of a girl, her face pale with terror, her eyes wide and wild, holding a rifle that was almost as big as she was. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Bo started to laugh. "Look at this," he sneered. "The little kitten has claws." He took a step toward her. "Don't!" Clara's voice was a ragged whisper. But her hesitation, her trembling, had given them back their courage. Pike's eyes hardened. "Get the gun, Finn, and grab the boy while you're at it. He'll make a fine bargaining chip." Finn, who had been covering Ezra, now turned his attention to the cabin. He saw Isaac, who had crept out of the bedroom and was now standing, terrified, in the doorway behind Clara. Finn grinned and started toward him. Ezra, seeing the new threat, tried to rise, but Pike kicked his legs out from under him. Finn reached the porch, shoving Clara aside. He grabbed Isaac by the arm, the boy crying out in fear and pain. Something inside Clara snapped. The world went silent. All the fear, all the hesitation, vanished, burned away by a pure, white-hot protective rage. The rifle, which had felt so heavy and awkward, now felt like an extension of her own will. She raised it, the stock settling against her shoulder as if it belonged there. She looked down the long barrel, and her shaking stopped. Her world narrowed to a single point: the man who was holding Isaac. She saw his leering face, the fear in the boy's eyes. She put the bead of the front sight on Bo's shoulder. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening, a roar that shook the entire canyon. The rifle kicked back against her shoulder with the force of a mule, sending a jarring shock through her entire body. The smell of sulfur and burnt powder filled the air. Bo screamed, a high, thin sound of shock and pain. He staggered backward, clutching at his shoulder, a dark, spreading stain appearing on his shirt. He released Isaac, who scrambled away, back toward the safety of the cabin. The shot had broken the spell. Pike, his face a mask of fury, drew his own pistol and leveled it at Clara. But before he could fire, another sound echoed through the canyon, a sound even more final and terrifying than her own rifle shot. It was the double-barreled roar of a shotgun. From the direction of the barn, an old, wiry man with skin like tanned leather and a shock of white hair had appeared. He held a smoking shotgun, its twin muzzles pointed squarely at Pike. "That's far enough." The old man's voice was gravelly, calm, and carried the absolute authority of death. It was Raoul, Ezra's only neighbor, an old ranch hand who lived a solitary life a few miles up the canyon. He must have heard the commotion and come to investigate. Finn, seeing the new threat, turned his pistol toward Raoul. It was a fatal mistake. The shotgun roared again. Finn was thrown backward as if by an invisible hand, landing in a heap in the dust. Pike looked from the fallen Finn to the bleeding Bo, to the old man with the shotgun, and finally to Clara, who was still holding the rifle, her eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen before. The fight was over. He had lost. With a curse, he turned, grabbed the reins of his horse, and scrambled into the saddle, digging his heels in and galloping away, back through the fissure, disappearing from their lives as violently as he had entered them. Bo, clutching his arm, stumbled after him, leaving his companion behind. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the whimpering of Isaac and the ringing in Clara's ears. The rifle suddenly felt impossibly heavy. She let it slip from her grasp, its clatter on the wooden porch a jarring, final sound. Her eyes found Ezra. He was pushing himself up, his face pale, his movements slow and pained. He looked at her, his eyes full of 1,000 things she couldn't read: shock, relief, pride, pain. He took a single staggering step toward her, and then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed, face down, in the dust of the yard. The roar of the shotgun faded, leaving a silence that was heavier and more terrifying than the violence itself. For a heartbeat, Clara was frozen, the empty rifle a dead weight in her hands. Then Ezra fell, and the world shattered. A raw, guttural scream tore from her throat, a sound of pure, primal anguish. "Ezra!" She dropped the rifle, its clatter on the porch boards unheard, and flew across the yard. The body of the man Finn lay in the dust between them, a grim obstacle she barely registered as she scrambled to Ezra's side. She fell to her knees, her hands hovering over his still form, afraid to touch him, afraid of what she might find. "Get the boy inside," a gravelly voice commanded. It was Raoul, the old rancher, already reloading his shotgun with a grim efficiency. His face was a mask of hardened resolve, but his eyes, when they met Clara's for a split second, were full of a weary sorrow. Clara turned to see Isaac standing in the doorway, his small body trembling, his face chalk white and streaked with tears. The sight of him, so small and so terrified, pierced through her own panic. She scooped him up, her movements frantic, and pushed him into Raoul's arms. "Take him. Don't let him see." Raoul nodded, his gaze sweeping the yard. "I'll handle this. You see to him." With Isaac safe, Clara's entire universe shrank to the man lying motionless in the dirt. She gently rolled him over. His face was pale beneath the grime and blood, his breathing shallow and uneven. A dark, ugly bruise was already purpling along his temple. where the butt of a pistol had struck him. It was a vicious, deadly blow. His eyes were closed, and he was terrifyingly still. Together, she and Raoul carried him inside, his weight a terrible, limp burden. They laid him on his own bed, a simple rope-strung cot that now seemed as vast and empty as a final resting place. Raoul examined the head wound with a practiced eye, his touch surprisingly gentle. He cleaned it with whiskey and water, his lips a thin, grim line. "He's a tough man," Raoul said, his voice low, not looking at her. "But that's a bad one. Nothing to do now but wait and pray." He looked around the cabin, at the rifle she had used, at the splintered door. "I'll set things to right outside. You stay with him." And so Clara's vigil began. The world outside the cabin ceased to exist. Raoul came and went, a silent, grim specter. He mended the broken door, tended to the animals, and buried the dead man in an unmarked grave at the far end of the canyon. All while Clara remained anchored to the chair she had pulled up beside Ezra's bed. She did not sleep. She did not eat. She became a creature of pure, focused will, her entire existence dedicated to the single, desperate task of keeping Ezra tethered to the world. Time blurred into a meaningless cycle of light and shadow. The first day, she did nothing but watch him, her hands clenched in her lap, listening to the faint, rattling sound of his every breath, terrified that each one would be his last. The silence in the room was a living entity, a heavy blanket that threatened to suffocate her with fear. On the second day, a fever took hold of him. His skin, which had been so pale, grew flushed and burned with a dry, intense heat. He began to murmur in his delirium, fragments of words and names that meant nothing to her, his head tossing from side to side on the pillow. The quiet was replaced by the terrifying sounds of a mind lost in a fiery labyrinth. That was when she began to work. Her fear, too large and amorphous to fight, was channeled into an endless series of small, concrete tasks. She kept a basin of cool water from the well by the bed at all times, endlessly soaking a clean linen cloth and laying it across his forehead. She would wipe the sweat from his face, her touch as light as a moth's wing, whispering nonsensical words of comfort that were as much for herself as for him. "It's all right, Ezra. I'm here. Just rest now." Raoul would appear in the doorway, his weathered face etched with concern. He would leave a bowl of thin broth or a cup of herbal tea on the table for her, but she would only wave him away. Her own needs had vanished. When Ezra's lips became cracked and dry, she would dip the corner of the cloth in water and moisten them. A slow, patient ritual she repeated 100 times a day. She tried to get him to drink, tipping a spoonful of thin, watery gruel against his lips, most of it dribbling uselessly down his chin. But a few drops would pass, and she would count it as a victory, a tiny battle won in a war she was terrified of losing. The days bled into one another. The third day, the fever raged. The fourth day, it broke in a torrent of sweat that soaked the bedding, leaving him pale and weak, but blessedly cool. Still, he did not wake. He lay in a deep, unnerving stillness that was in some ways more frightening than the fevered tossing. It was during this long, quiet stretch that she began to talk to him. At first, it was just small things, describing the light outside the window, or telling him that Isaac was being a good boy, that Raoul had fixed the fence, then needing to fill the vast, empty silence. Her eyes fell upon the small, worn Bible that sat on a shelf near the hearth. She began to read. Her voice, at first a hesitant whisper, grew stronger as the hours passed. She read the Psalms, the simple, ancient poetry, a strange comfort in the dim, quiet room. She read about green pastures and still waters, about valleys of shadow and the comfort of the rod and the staff. She didn't know if he could hear her, if the words were penetrating the deep fog that held him captive, but she imagined her voice as a rope, a lifeline she was casting out to him in the darkness. and she could not, would not, let it go. She read until her throat was raw. Then she would simply talk, her voice a low, continuous murmur. She told him about her childhood, the little she could remember that wasn't tainted by sadness. She told him about the wildflowers in the canyon, about the taste of the bread she had learned to bake. She told him everything and nothing, pouring her own life, her own fears, her own desperate, unspoken hope into the silent room, weaving a tapestry of sound to keep the final, ultimate silence at bay. She lost track of how many days had passed. A week more. Her world had shrunk to the four walls of this room, to the rise and fall of his chest, to the scent of sickness and soap and the sound of her own voice. Then, one afternoon, as the sun was casting long, golden fingers of light across the cabin floor, she was sitting by his bed, her head bowed in exhaustion, her hand resting near his on the quilt. His hand, which had been still for so long, twitched. Her head shot up, her heart leaping into her throat. She stared at his hand, her own breath held tight in her chest. Had she imagined it, she watched, unblinking, for what felt like an eternity. Then, it happened again. A definite, undeniable movement of his fingers. "Ezra." The name was a fragile, broken whisper. His eyelids, which had been sealed shut, fluttered. A low groan escaped his lips. Clara leaned closer, her entire being focused on his face. Slowly, painfully, his eyes opened. At first, they were unfocused, clouded with confusion as he stared up at the wooden ceiling. Then they shifted, turning toward her. They were bleary, shadowed with pain, but they were his eyes, and they were seeing her. He was seeing her. A great, shuddering wave of relief washed through her, so powerful it left her dizzy. All the words she had spoken, all the speeches she had rehearsed in her mind for this moment, vanished. The tears she had refused to shed for days now burned at the back of her eyes, but she held them back. The grand emotions were too much. All that was left was the simple, overwhelming, miraculous truth. Her voice was thick, barely more than a breath. "You're still here." It was a question, a statement, and a prayer all in one. It held all the terror of the past week and all the hope for the future, in 3 small words. Ezra looked at her, his gaze clearing. He seemed to understand everything she had packed into that simple sentence. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Instead, with a strength that seemed impossible, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I'm still here." And then, for the first time, he reached for her. His movement was weak, faltering, but it was full of purpose. His calloused, trembling fingers found her hand where it rested on the bed. His grip was not strong, but it was absolute. He wrapped his fingers around hers, his thumb stroking weakly against her skin. It was an anchor. It was a promise. It was the first and most profound word in a conversation they had been having for months. Clara's fingers tightened around his, and the unshed tears finally fell. Silent drops that traced paths through the grime and exhaustion on her cheeks. She didn't pull away, and he did not let go. In the quiet, sun-drenched cabin, surrounded by the ghosts of violence, 2 hands clasped, a silent, unbreakable testament to the simple, stubborn, and beautiful fact of survival. Ezra's return to the world was not a sudden flood of light, but a slow, arduous tide creeping back to a shore that had been scoured clean by the storm. The first few days after he woke were a fragile dance between sleeping and waking, between moments of pained clarity and long stretches of hazy, exhausted silence. His hand, which had first found hers in a moment of returning consciousness, rarely let go. It was as if he needed that physical anchor to keep from being pulled back under by the deep, dark currents of his injury. Clara became his shadow, his hands, his voice. She was the steady center around which their fractured world began to turn. She fed him the thin broths and watery gruels that Raoul brought, spoonful by patient spoonful, her movements gentle and sure. She recounted the events of the attack in a low, calm voice, editing out the true horror of it, focusing not on the violence, but on the outcome. "You're safe. Isaac is safe. We are all safe now." She did not tell him that she had fired the rifle. Not yet. The weight of that act was hers alone to carry for now. During this slow, quiet time of healing, a profound shift occurred. Clara was no longer the one being sheltered. With Ezra incapacitated, she became the shelter. She ran the homestead with a quiet competence that surprised even herself. She rose before dawn. Her first act to check on Ezra, her second to stoke the fire. She cooked for Isaac and Raoul. She tended her small garden. She milked their single, stubborn goat. She learned the heft of the axe, and though her first attempts at splitting wood were clumsy and exhausting, she managed to keep the wood pile from dwindling. The constant, demanding rhythm of the work was a blessing. It left no room for the ghosts of the past to whisper in the quiet moments. She was too busy living to remember what it was like to run. Ezra watched her. In his long hours of stillness, his eyes would follow her as she moved about the cabin. He saw the new confidence in her posture, the efficiency in her movements. He saw the way she comforted Isaac, her hand gentle on his hair, her voice a soft murmur. He saw her talking to Raoul, discussing whether the last of the potatoes should be brought in, her expression serious and thoughtful. He was seeing a woman he had never met before. The frightened girl who had hidden under his coat on the train was gone. In her place was a woman forged in the crucible of that bloody afternoon, a woman who had stood her ground, who had faced down monsters to protect her home. He saw all of this, and in his silence, a new kind of respect, deeper and more profound than mere gratitude, took root. The soundtrack to their healing was the sound of Raoul's hammer. The old man, having appointed himself their guardian, had decided the barn roof was a disgrace. Every day, from sunup to sundown, the steady, rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack of his hammer echoed through the canyon. It was the sound of rebuilding. It was the sound of life being put back in order, one nail, one shingle at a time. It was a sound that told Clara they were not just surviving the aftermath, but actively repairing their world. The day Ezra first stood was a monumental occasion. Leaning heavily on Clara, his face pale and beaded with sweat, he made the short, agonizing journey from his bed to the chair by the fire. He sat there for a long time, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but his eyes were clear. He looked around the clean, orderly cabin, at the stack of neatly mended clothes on the table, at the pot of stew simmering on the hearth. And then he looked at Clara. He didn't speak, but his eyes held a depth of emotion that made her heart ache. His recovery quickened after that. Soon, he was able to walk to the porch, then to the corral. His strength returned in slow, hard-won increments, and as he began to reclaim his role in the world, the dynamic between them settled into a new, unspoken partnership. She was no longer his ward. She was his equal. They began to work side by side. When the time came to harvest the last of the vegetables from her garden, he was there. He couldn't yet do the heavy digging, so he sat on an overturned bucket, his long knife in hand, and trimmed the carrots and potatoes she pulled from the earth. They worked in a comfortable, companionable silence. The only sounds the scrape of his knife and the soft thud of vegetables being dropped into the basket. One afternoon, a section of the corral fence needed mending. It was a task he would have normally done alone, but now, Clara was there, holding the new post steady while he used the heavy mallet to drive it into the ground. The work was slow, his movement still hampered by a lingering dizziness. After one particularly hard swing, he swayed on his feet. He reached out, his hand finding her arm to steady himself. When the moment of dizziness passed, his hand did not leave. It simply rested there, his calloused fingers a warm weight on her skin. It was no longer a gesture of need, but of simple connection. They stood like that for a long moment, the sun warm on their backs, the only sound the nickering of the horses. He wasn't just holding on, he was holding her. Their new language, the one born in silence and forged in violence. blossomed in these small, quiet moments. A new vocabulary of shared glances and gentle touches emerged. One evening, Isaac, in a fit of pure, childish joy, managed to get more stew on his face than in his mouth. Clara looked up at Ezra, a small, exasperated sigh on her lips, and saw something she had never seen before. The corner of Ezra's mouth was turned up in a small, closed-lip smile. It was not a grin, not a laugh, but a flicker of pure, unadulterated amusement. Their eyes met over the boy's messy head, and they shared the smile, a secret, perfect moment of joy that belonged only to them. The laughter of the boy was the true measure of their new peace. Isaac, who had been so quiet and withdrawn in the days following the attack, had found his voice again. His joyous, unrestrained laughter now echoed through the canyon as he chased lizards or helped Raoul with some small, important task. His laughter was the proof that their home was whole again, that the shadows had been chased away not just from the yard, but from their hearts. He was the living embodiment of their future. Clara realized, with a sense of dawning wonder, that she no longer needed to be saved. The realization didn't come in a flash, but in a series of quiet moments. It came when she effortlessly hoisted a heavy water bucket without thinking. It came when she looked out at the canyon and felt a sense of belonging, not of confinement. It came when she looked at the rifle mounted back above the hearth and felt not terror, but a grim satisfaction. She was not a victim who had been rescued. She was a survivor who had fought for her life, for her home. She was no longer the girl who had pleaded to hide under a stranger's coat. She was a woman who was building a life, side by side, with the man she trusted, the man she loved. That word, love, was still unspoken between them. It lived in the way he would now watch her walk away, his gaze lingering. It lived in the way she would find a small, perfect feather or an interesting stone left on her windowsill. It lived in the quiet evenings by the fire, where the space between their chairs seemed to shrink, filled with a warmth and an understanding that was more powerful than any spoken vow. One evening, as the last light of the sun painted the canyon walls in hues of rose and violet, she and Ezra stood on the porch, watching the sky. Raoul had finished the roof, and the neat, strong lines of the barn stood as a proud testament to their collective resilience. Isaac was asleep inside. The world was utterly still. Clara was no longer a person defined by what she had fled from. She was defined by where she stood, by the solid wood of the porch beneath her feet, by the scent of pine and wood smoke in the air, and by the solid, reassuring presence of the man standing beside her. She didn't need to hide anymore. She was already home. The seasons bled one into the next, and the hidden canyon became a world unto itself, a complete and breathing universe governed by the rising sun and the slow, steady rhythm of their shared work. Winter came, blanketing the high red cliffs in a surprising layer of pristine white snow, and they spent the long, dark evenings in the warm, golden circle of the firelight. It was a time of quiet intimacy, of shared silence that was deeper and more comfortable than any conversation. Spring arrived with a rush of green, a defiant surge of life that filled the creek bed and painted the canyon floor with 1,000 tiny, hopeful flowers. Ezra's strength had returned completely, the harsh lines of his face softening with a contentment Clara had never thought she would see. He moved with his old, quiet grace. But there was a new lightness to his step. The weight he had carried, the profound solitude that had defined him, had been lifted. He was no longer an island, but part of a shore, connected to the small, vibrant lives that now revolved around him. Clara had been reborn in this place. The last traces of the haunted, fleeing girl were gone, burned away by the fire of the attack and healed by the gentle salve of a life lived with purpose and love. She moved with a confidence that came from knowing her own strength. She was a partner, not a dependent. Her hands, once soft, then scarred, were now simply capable, as skilled at baking bread as they were at helping Ezra reset a loose stone in the foundation of the barn. Their life was a tapestry woven from 1,000 small, ordinary moments. It was the way Ezra would now pause in his work just to watch her hang laundry, the clean white sheets brilliant against the blue sky. It was the way her hand would instinctively find his in the quiet moments after supper. It was the shared, secret smiles they exchanged over Isaac's head as the boy recounted some grand adventure. Isaac himself was the bright, vibrant heart of their new world, his laughter the canyon's most joyful music. He was a happy, fearless boy, secure in the unwavering love of the two quiet adults who were his entire world. One evening in late spring, as the sun began its slow, magnificent descent, the work was finally done. A long, arduous day of clearing new ground for a larger garden was behind them. A sense of weary satisfaction settled over the homestead, a peace earned through sweat and shared labor. Raoul had already departed for his own small cabin higher up the canyon, leaving the three of them in the golden twilight. After they had eaten, and Isaac was tucked, sleepy and content, into his bed, Ezra came to where Clara stood on the porch. He didn't speak. He simply stood beside her for a moment, then gave a slight nod toward the high meadow that formed the western end of their sanctuary, a place where the canyon walls sloped gently away to meet the sky. It was a place they had not yet explored together. It was a silent invitation. She answered with a small smile, and they began to walk, side by side, their footsteps falling into an easy, familiar rhythm on the dusty path. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and the sweet perfume of evening primrose. They walked out of the shadows of the canyon walls and into the last, brilliant rays of the setting sun. The meadow was a breathtaking sea of wildflowers, Indian paintbrush, desert marigolds, and delicate bluebells swayed in the gentle evening breeze, their colors a vibrant tapestry under the vast, open sky. It was as if all the beauty and hope she had seen in that one single flower he had pressed in his book had multiplied 1,000-fold, spreading out before them as a promise. They stopped at the edge of the field, the golden light bathing them, turning the dust on their clothes into a kind of gilded armor. For a long time, they just stood, silent witnesses to the day's majestic end. The world felt vast and quiet, and they were the only two people in it. Clara looked at the man beside her. She saw the familiar lines of his profile, the strength in his jaw, the quiet kindness in the set of his mouth. He was no longer the fearsome, intimidating stranger from the train. He was the man who had sheltered her, protected her, and, in his quiet, steady way, had shown her the meaning of home. He was the man she loved with a depth and certainty that felt as solid as the ancient rocks surrounding them. She reached out and laid her hand on his forearm. The muscle was hard and unyielding beneath her touch, a familiar, comforting strength. He turned his head to look at her, his eyes full of a quiet, questioning warmth. All the words she had held in her heart, all the gratitude and love that had grown in the silent spaces between them, rose up, needing to be spoken. "I remember the girl who got on that train, Ezra," she began, her voice soft but clear in the still air. "She was so frightened. All she wanted was to disappear, to find a shadow deep enough to swallow her whole." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the beautiful, open meadow. "When I first saw you, I thought you were just another shadow, a safe place to hide for a moment. I begged to hide under your coat, because the world was too bright and too terrifying to face." She turned her eyes back to his, and she did not look away. "You gave me that. You let me hide, but you did something more. You gave me a place to stand. You gave me the ground beneath my feet again. You gave me a home to fight for. You gave me a reason to stop running." She drew a deep breath, her heart full, her voice steady with a conviction that came from the very core of her being. "At first, I asked only to hide under your coat. Now I just want to stand beside you, through the sun and the storm, for all my days." The declaration hung in the golden air, a vow as solemn and binding as any ever spoken in a church. It was the culmination of their entire journey, the final, freely offered truth of her heart. Ezra did not speak. Words were not his craft, but his eyes, in the fading light, held a universe of emotion. He looked at her, and in his gaze, she saw all the unspoken words of love, respect, and devotion that 100 poets could not capture. He slowly lifted his hand and covered hers where it rested on his arm. His grip was firm, his calloused thumb stroking the back of her hand in a gesture of infinite tenderness. He squeezed her hand. A single, powerful affirmation that said everything his voice could not. Yes, always. He held her gaze for another moment, then turned his eyes to the field of flowers before them. Without releasing her hand, he took a step forward, leading them away from the path, away from the shadows of the past, and into the sea of vibrant, resilient life. They walked into the heart of the meadow, the setting sun at their backs. They were no longer running. They were not hiding. They were simply walking forward, together, into the future they would build with their own hands, in a West that was still harsh, still unforgiving. Two hearts beat as one. They had found their sanctuary, not in a hidden canyon, but in each other. They were home. Thank you so much for listening to our story. If you enjoyed it, please let us know in the comments where you're listening from in the world. We love hearing from you and sharing in this community. Please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd like to help this story reach more listeners, please hit the hype button to show your support. We'll see you in the next tale.